Welcome, everyone. Sorry for the delay. I'm Jeff Tapper, and today we'll be talking about build versus buy, choosing the right video player for your project. And so a couple of the key points I want to hit through here. We'll go over a quick high level of the streaming landscape today, talk a little bit about formats, a little bit about the various options we have on desktops today, talk about who are some of the off-the-shelf providers, who's out there, who can we start working with right away, what does it mean to build it yourself, how do we do it, how do you find the right fit. Then we'll have a summary, time for questions. If there's questions throughout the process, feel free to ask questions anywhere in here. The more interactive this is, I think the more effective it is for all of us. So don't just wait for the end to ask questions. Feel free to ask them, except for Rob. No, Rob, even you can ask questions. All right, so I'm Jeff Tapper. I'm a senior consultant at Digital Primates. We build next-generation applications. We're not designers. We build front-end applications. We're engineers. We make things work really well. We don't make them pretty. We've got partners that know how to do that. But our whole mission at Digital Primates is to make things work on the client. We've been building video applications for a while, and we've built some of the most watched video events on the internet, or in the internet's history, I should say. Personally, I've been building internet applications for a little over 20 years now. I've had a chance to write a couple of books along the way. All of the slides and all of the code samples I have, you can find on GitHub. Here's the address of my GitHub repo where you can find all of this. And since I'm not actually running off of my laptop when I go to show the code, I will be showing it to you directly from GitHub. All right, so the question, now that you know who I am, is who the hell are you? How many of you are developers? How many of you are managers? Designers? Okay, who are the rest of you? What are you doing here? Are you generally comfortable? How many of you are comfortable looking at code samples? And the inverse of that, how many are not comfortable looking at code samples? Okay, so sorry for the two of you that aren't. We're going to look at some code. I'll try to make it as painless as possible. So the streaming landscape. Obviously, there's been a lot going on in video in the past few years. We've got a vast proliferation of devices, of codecs, of formats, protocols even that we have available to us. And it's very difficult for folks who just have content they want to share on the web to figure out what is it they need. What do I need to do to get these videos to them, my customers? And so it's getting more and more complex, but in some ways it's getting simpler. Right? Over the years, we've had various transitions from standalone desktop applications to play online video, to browser plugins for playing online video, and now we have the ability to play video directly in the browser. And so we can see that many of these choices still exist, and we'll sort of talk through what this all means and where we're going with it. Streaming protocols. How many of you are familiar with the real-time protocols, RTMP, RTSP, RTP? About half of you. How many of you are familiar with the HTTP protocols? Excellent. And again, there's four main variations there. There's several others that get not less mentioned, but these are your four primary of the HTTP streaming protocols. Some things people tend to assume these days that the real-time protocols are obsolete and no longer useful. That's not actually true. There is still a time and a place for real-time protocols. They have one massive advantage over any of the HTTP streaming protocols. They are ultra low latency. If you want to get information, if you want to get the content to the end user in near real time, the real-time protocols, they are your friend. If you want to service a really large audience, they're not so much your friend. They're not great about scaling to high volumes. They require a lot more server infrastructure. Whereas with the HTTP protocols, really all you need is a web server. And web servers are built for pushing out files to large volumes, and there's all sorts of internet efficiencies that we have in caching servers and things of that sort that make HTTP really efficient for servicing large audiences. Couple downsides, as I say, there is much more latency. When we talk about the low latency of the real-time protocols, we're talking about a quarter of a second of latency. When we talk about low latency in the HTTP protocols, we're talking about, at the lowest, 5 to 10 seconds of delay. In most real-world scenarios, 30 to 60 seconds behind the actual live event. So there are some serious differences, but it is the main reason so many people use this today is because it scales very well. But like anything else, you need to understand your own use cases and figure out, does it make more sense? Do I need to service 10 million simultaneous viewers? Or is it more important for me to get this information to the end user as quickly as possible? I have some customers that are doing real-time auctions, both in person and over the web. Ultra-low latency is extremely important to them. If the person watching online is 30 seconds behind, the auction's going to be over before they ever get a chance to put their bid in. So of our HTTP protocols, smooth streaming, anyone working with smooth? Small handful of you. It's Microsoft standard. It works great. It's still very viable in Xbox. It was the standard for Silverlight for a while. DRM via PlayReady. HDS, any Flash devs that are HDS people? Again, this was Adobe's standard. Worked great in Flash. And again, Primetime DRM, which was once known as Adobe Access, was the DRM that goes along with that. HLS, I'm guessing many of you are working with HLS. This is Apple's protocol. And again, they have a variety. If you're doing it natively in the browser, you have FairPlay. You have, if you're building iOS applications, you can use virtually anyone as long as there's an SDK. And there's SDKs for all the major ones. One thing that you'll notice about these three protocols I've mentioned, they are all owned and maintained by an individual company. The fourth of the protocols is MPEG-Dash. And Dash stands for Dynamic Adaptive Streaming over HTTP. And the nicest thing about Dash is it is open. It's an open standard. It is an internationally defined and accepted standard. It is owned by no one. There's no one that can go and make changes to it without people who want to have a say having a say in it. And that's a beautiful thing. It works well with many devices today. It is entirely agnostic when it comes to DRM. Use any DRM you want. Codecs, use any codec you want. File format, use any file format you want. Dash doesn't care. Dash simply describes how to find the content. It's extremely flexible, which really is part of the downside of Dash. As a client-side developer, it becomes very painful to build Dash players because Dash can mean so many different things. There are so many different permutations on how Dash can be done. How many of you are working with Dash today? Excellent. I ask the same question virtually every year here, and it's gone from no hands to one or two hands now to almost half of you, so that's phenomenal. So playing the desktop today are three main options: Silverlight, Flash, and HTML with media source extensions. Silverlight was once a dominant player, has fallen from its pedestal, and is largely not supported in many browsers today. Anyone still running Silverlight applications? Two of you, okay. Flash, how many of you are still running Flash applications? That would be fully expected. So again, Flash is the dominant desktop video platform today. It's still, I believe Will Law from Akamai was saying this morning that 45% of all their video traffic is going to Flash players. Now remember, Flash is only on the desktop, and a significant amount of video traffic goes to set-top boxes, goes to mobile devices, goes to all sorts of places that Flash doesn't exist. This is still the primary place where video gets played on desktops today. It relies on the Pepper APIs, which means it's not getting shut off with the Google shutdown of the NS APIs, so it will continue to exist for the near future. It remains strong, but it's falling. It is starting to falter. Less and less people want to use Flash if they don't have to today. People want to get to a model where we don't have plugins. And so that is the state of Flash. And of course, HTML5 is expected to be the dominant player of the future. It's a major player today. We are doing lots of streaming video to HTML5 players, specifically using media source extensions. How many of you are using HTML5 players today? And how many of you guys are using media source extensions for those? Small handful of you. Okay, and that's fine. The thing you'll find about HTML5 players, they all support progressive download, right? You can just say, hey, give me this file, and it will play you back that file. What media source extensions do for us is give us the ability to download individual pieces of video and play them back a little at a time. So in terms of the browsers today, here's the major landscape with asterisks along the way. Most of them support media source extensions, except for Safari on Windows does not, Safari on iOS does not. They all support H.264. Chrome and Firefox support VP8 and VP9. I've been told Edge is going to support VP9 and VP10. HLS is only natively supported in Safari on Mac and iOS. You can build support with media source extensions on anyone that has media source extensions. And Dash with media source extensions can be played anywhere that has media source extensions. And now the interesting thing about media source extensions, well, we'll talk about those, I think, in the next slide. Media source extensions, as I mentioned earlier, they are effectively an API for the video tag. They give us the ability to hand individual pieces of video content off to the video tag and let it play out that piece of content. And what this does for us, though, is it gives us the ability to, well, first of all, easily seek, right? If you decide you want to jump somewhere else, you don't need to download the whole file up to that point and jump into that point. You can simply say, okay, now give me segment 27 instead of where I currently was. The other thing, since we have it broken up into small segments, is we can make decisions about switching from one bit rate to another. And we can build out adaptive bitrate streaming applications natively in HTML, which is, of course, where most of my clients want to be. They're not universally supported yet, but they're getting closer and closer. Just a week or two ago, Firefox finally added their media source extension support into their released build, into build 42. So that's nice. And it was in March, and I believe it's still correct now. It's a candidate recommendation to the HTML working group, which means it's effectively a specification that has now been recommended. So it is virtually in place. So in terms of our off-the-shelf providers, there's thousands of them. I'm going to talk about a small handful today. Primetime, BitDash, CastLabs, Dash.js, Flow, JW, Video.js. Those are the main ones that I'll be hitting on today. How many of you are using any of these? How many of you are building your own? Excellent. And how many of you are neither building your own nor using one of these, meaning using a different platform? What are you using? What's that? The platform. Okay. And who else raised their hand on that one? So each of these have a JavaScript version. Most of them also have a Flash version. Dash.js, of course, does not. That's a purely JavaScript one. Video.js does have a Flash fallback as well. Okay, that's certainly another worthwhile one. Again, as I say, there are hundreds of different viable players out there. These are the ones that I see the most through my clients. And so just a quick little tour through them in terms of what is and what is not supported. So you see of the ones I've listed, again, I'm very partial to Dash, so you'll notice that these all support Dash, which is probably part of why they're the ones that are most used by my clients. Many of them also have support for HLS. Most also have support for progressive download. All of them support adaptive bitrate. They all have some version of supporting captions. They all have some version of supporting DRM. And most have a mobile component to them, although what that means on each platform is pretty wildly different. Some of them have full-on APIs for building out your applications, your mobile applications. Others support mobile web on some platforms and not other. So the mobile, that mobile column itself could be a whole other chart going into far more detail. But I can only make the font so small and still have it be readable. So let's take a look at a couple of these, if I can figure out how to do this over here. And so I'm going to pull this up. Unfortunately, we're not on my laptop. So I'm pulling it up directly from GitHub because we had some technical difficulties. And how do I get this so you guys can see? Do Do I need to exit out of presenter mode? Is that what I need to do? Uh-oh. Well, that's not going to work. All right. Sorry, that was a massively failed experiment. Not on my own laptop. I apologize. Well, okay. Up in the GitHub where I have all of my samples, you can go and take a look at these. I was hoping to show them to you, but I don't know how to display them. Yeah, absolutely. It's, honestly, if you start with github.com, it's then my name, /Jeff Tapper. And let's get back to where we were. Well, this is going to shorten my presentation without having a bunch of code to walk you through. This is somewhat unfortunate. So let me talk through for you the building it yourself options. And again, most of the time that you're going to do this today, you are either going to use HTML, and by that I mostly mean media source extensions, or Flash, or more likely, a combination of the two. Now, why would you use a combination of the two? Any thoughts? If you have older browsers that don't support media source extensions, that's absolutely it. And of course, you can't just use Flash anymore because many browsers don't even, the new versions of Safari on Mac OS don't ship with Flash. So you can't even assume that everyone has Flash. Like several years ago, everyone always had Flash. There was never a question that Flash was available. That's no longer a necessarily safe assumption. So you generally want to make sure that whatever you build, you're going to have both a Flash version, a Flash fallback, and an HTML version. Silverlight, as I say, is a less viable solution. Again, if you're working primarily in corporate intranets and you're largely on Internet Explorer, Silverlight remains a viable option. But for the public web, Silverlight's market share has dropped precipitously, especially with the removal of the NS APIs from Chrome. And let me talk through, since I don't have the code, the way that you would go ahead and start to build these. And assuming, again, if you're going to build them for HTML, what you're going to do is you're going to be looking at the HTTP protocols, right? So you're mostly Dash or HLS. And fundamentally, what you're going to do to get started, you're going to be passed a manifest file. You'll be given a reference to the URL for, if it's HLS, it'll be an M3U8 file. If it's Dash, it'll be an MPD. And what these files are really a description of what the content is and where to find the content. And so it will make available for you a list of what all the various bit rates are, each of the renditions, and where they can be found. And specifically for each file within that rendition, what each segment is. What's the URL of each segment so they can each be downloaded. So as you're building your player, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to be able to build something that will download the manifest, parse the manifest. And again, whether you're parsing Dash or HLS, there's some differences there. Specifically, Dash uses an XML-based format. HLS is not. It's more of a pure text-based format. But either way, they both have a very set way of describing where to find the content. Once you know where to find the content, you're going to make a decision, what bit rate am I going to start at? Remember, the manifest tells you what all the available bit rates will be. So you'll choose a bit rate, and you will then start downloading the files for that bit rate. One of the things about media source extensions today is that on all of the supported browsers, they will run ISO BMFF, which are effectively fragmented MP4 files. If you're running on Chrome, it will also support WebM as a container format. But let's just talk about the fragmented MP4. It's a simpler case to understand. So assuming we have our files in Dash that are available for that, we'll download the files and start to be able to hand them over to the media source extensions. If we're running HLS, HLS uses MPEG-2 transport stream, which is a different file format. It's not ISO BMFF. And so if you want to be able to use media source extensions for that, what you need to do is to do a client-side transmux, effectively rewrite the file in memory of the browser inside JavaScript from MPEG-2 transport stream into ISO BMFF. And it sounds really daunting. There's actually a number of open source libraries available to do that today. It's not terrible. It's not the most efficient in the world, but it's actually reasonably efficient, and you can do it reasonably well. So again, if you're in HLS, you'll do this client-side transmux. If you're in Dash, there's no transmux needed. You can simply, ultimately, you're handing over just an ISO BMFF file to the browser, and the browser can then play back that segment for you.
Can you deal with the names of the libraries that you have?
So HLS.js is one of them. You'll also find, I know Video.js has a package that they're using. I don't think they're actually using HLS.js, but they have a package that in their open source project that does it. I believe JW is also, I don't know if they've released it yet, but they have one that's at least in the works if it's not released yet. Rob.
How does the browser's performance for that transmux compare to, say, Flash doing it for HLS?
It was more efficient in Flash than it was in the browser. So the question was performance comparison. We would often, when writing the same types of applications in Flash, we would do the same thing, although instead of transmuxing it to ISO BMFF, we were transmuxing it to FLV, which is the native Flash file format. And it was more efficient in Flash, but the JavaScript transmux is actually reasonably efficient. It's not an order of magnitude slower. It's probably, 1.5 times slower or something like that. I haven't run the metric. And again, with each new version of the browsers, the JavaScript engine underneath them is getting faster, so the difference between the two is probably going to rapidly diminish. It's an interesting question. So the question is, in terms of the devices, the phones and tablets and set-top boxes, do they tend to have the horsepower to actually do this type of client-side transmux? And honestly, these will work reasonably well on Android phones and tablets. Most of the set-top boxes don't have that modern, the software in them was mostly built several years ago because it takes a long time to get hardware to market. So these tricks aren't going to work very well there, although most of those devices will natively support HLS. So you probably wouldn't be using a JavaScript solution for your playback in those cases. No problem. There other questions on this while we're here? All right, so where did I put that remote? All right, so things to think about as you're trying to figure out what's the right fit. Which, should I build it myself? Should I take an off-the-shelf player? There's one of the first things that you're going to want to consider is cost. There is a widely divergent cost on the off-the-shelf players from totally free with a permissive open source license to not even close to free. And if you're not, a multi-billion-dollar company, you may not even want to think about it. And so one of the first things you're going to want to consider is, what's the price point? Is this going to make sense for me? If you're going to build it yourself, you also want to consider the price in terms of your development time. Do you have the staff it's going to take to build and maintain this? Many of my larger customers build their own players. They don't use the off-the-shelf players. Some of the large ones do, but the vast majority of the larger players, they like the control of building it to be exactly what they want, as opposed to trying to retrofit somebody else's player into their specific needs. Most of the smaller companies I work with do not build their own players. They use the various off-the-shelf players. Things to think about, are you looking for a fully managed service versus a standalone player? Do you want something that's going to provide a whole digital asset management service where it manages your content and it does your transcoding and it does all of that for you? Or do you simply want something to play back some video files that you have? What other services are needed? Do you want to support? Do you need closed captioning? Do you need HLS and Dash support? Do you want to support just one or the other? Do you need support for Roku and Xbox? Do you just need support for web and phones? On phones, is mobile web enough? Do you need native applications? These are all different questions that I can't answer for you. You have to figure out for yourself what's going to make sense for your company and your use cases about which platforms you want to make, which platforms are a good fit for you. As fairly obvious, the cheaper the solutions tend to be, the less full-featured they tend to be. There's a reason that The more expensive ones are more expensive. I mentioned what platforms you need to support, what budget you have, how much customization do you need to do? Are is the standard skin of the HTML5 video player, is that adequate for you? Do you want to have a lot of customization around the look and feel of the player? Do you want to have customization over the adaptive bitrate algorithms that you use? Some of these allow for it, others don't. And again, that's not an important use case for everyone, but for folks who that is important for, it's very important. And so it's just a matter of finding what's the right fit for what you need. So, on the more upbeat note, there's never been a time that you had more viable choices. There are tons and tons of great choices out there today for you. And again, there are great free choices. There are great paid choices. There are tons of valid, viable options for you. Other things that you want to consider is what platforms do you need to be on? I know most of the customers I talk to, they want to be on every possible platform ever. That, of course, comes with a cost. Are your users really going to go look for you on Xbox, on Roku, on Apple TV? If they are, then you should absolutely be there. If they're not, then maybe that's not worth the investment for you to build out those applications on those. Certainly web and mobile, virtually everyone needs to be in those platforms today. But there are thousands of other platforms out there, and adding each additional platform comes with a cost. Be aware of the costs, make decisions that make sense for you and your company. Right? It's easy to choose a player off the shelf. It's relatively easy to build your own players, or at least to get started building your own players. They can get rapidly complex as you add more and more business rules to them. So all sorts of choices that you have that you just need to figure out what's the right fit, what works for you. All right, so with that said, what other questions do you have? So the question is, of the off-the-shelf players, which are the ones that are easiest to configure the schemes? And what do you mean the schemes? Oh, the skins, sorry. Honestly, with most of the modern players today are all using CSS for skinning, so they're all relatively easy. I'm partial to Video.js. That's a nice one. JW Player does a nice job. The Flow Player does a nice job. Kaltura does a nice job. Ooyala does a nice. They're all pretty customizable. So the question is, if you write your own. Let me see if I'm getting the question right. When you write your own player and it is largely in JavaScript, it's very difficult to protect the source code of your player. Others can more or less go and download your source code and see exactly what you're doing. And in general, that's true. There are certain techniques that people have for obfuscating their code and for making it harder for somebody to steal your player. You generally want to avoid putting proprietary technology in JavaScript because you can't really protect it. People will be able to get at it. And again, oftentimes, most of the services, Video.js has the whole Bright Cove platform behind them where the Video.js is a great player. Most of the proprietary technology lives on the server in their platform. Same thing, again, JW likewise has a platform behind it, and Ooyala and Kaltura and on and on. But yes, certainly a good question. Okay, so the question about content protection and when you're building your own players and what are some of the best practices. And I broadened your question from just DRM to content protection because oftentimes that's what people really mean. Oftentimes what people don't need the full-on studio DRM, the PlayReadies and Widevines and primetime DRMs of the world. But oftentimes a tokenization scheme is perfectly adequate for protecting the content. If you use a rolling token so that with each request there's a server piece that matches up to it, so it knows that it's only going to serve it up if it has a currently valid token. And That's generally going a little too excessive. For the most I see for protecting manifests in the vast majority of my clients these days is serving them over HTTPS, right? Using SSL or TLS, really, it's not SSL anymore. TLS to secure them. That way people can't sniff at them over the wire. But generally, if you have a decent protection scheme in place for the actual content, if they can get at your manifest, it's not really a big deal.
If you are using Studio mandated security, is there a single off-the-shelf solution?
So if you do need Studio-approved DRMs, is there a single off-the-shelf solution that is available to you? There's not a single DRM that is going to work everywhere for you, but with common encryption that we have now, it is possible to encrypt the content once and have several different license servers based on what platform it's playing back on, and that is the sort of answer to that particular conundrum. Before common encryption, we ended up having to re-encode or repackage with several different DRMs, and the storage costs were getting ridiculous. Absolutely. And so really what he's talking about, which is all sort of fell under my one bullet point of additional services, integration with third parties is, for most major use cases, an absolute requirement. Interacting with ad networks, interacting with analytics networks. And if you have those requirements, if you are monetizing your application via advertising, if you need to track what's happening, and again, in some small cases it's not necessary, in most major cases it is, you want to make sure that the players you choose integrate well with the tool sets you want to integrate with, right? If you want to use DoubleClick for ads, or if you want to use Freewheel for ads, you want to make sure that the platform you choose will integrate with whatever technology stack you have. It's a good point. Thank you, Neil. Well, so the question, how can you know? The internet, of course. Each of these players I mentioned has extensive websites behind them, and you can find out exactly what is and what is not supported. Most of the ones I mentioned are open source projects, or at least have an open source component to them. So for instance, things like Video.js has a rich plugin architecture where folks have written additional add-ons for several of these other pieces. You can browse through, you can see which, are the pieces, are there plugins, are there support for the ones that are important to me. So all of the players I'm talking about today all have a pure HTML MSE implementation. Every one of them can play without NS APIs and have the ability to play without Flash and the Pepper APIs too. Excellent question. Okay, so the question becomes, companies that are currently supporting HLS everywhere, as they want to start to embrace more MSE and start transitioning over to Dash. Does it make sense to begin to support both formats, to have both renditions, or rendition's the wrong word, both versions of the content, both formats of the content, the HLS and Dash? And the short answer is yes, especially if you're working with a CDN or a server that is capable of repackaging for you at the edge. While storage is getting cheaper and cheaper, there is a storage cost to keeping two different packagings of the same content, especially if you have 5 or 7 or 9 renditions of each file. Right. Right, exactly. So if you're going through exactly, if you're going through the CDNs and they're able to repackage for you as needed, by all means, support both formats. You'll ultimately find, what I've been finding is that Dash is an excellent solution in most places that aren't iOS. For iOS, while you can get native applications to play Dash on iOS, iOS is not, Dash is not the best answer for iOS. HLS clearly is. Dash is natively supported in the Xbox One. I don't know about PlayStation. None of my customers have me building PlayStation apps yet. But as soon as they hire me, I'll figure that out. Interesting. Question about best practices about live streaming to the mobile web on Android. Your short answer is going to be Dash and MSE. It's almost really the only available answer you have, right? And there's going to be, still a number of different considerations, and pull me aside and we can talk in far more detail over a beer later on. But there's a lot of nuance to getting the live streaming just right. But the Dash.js project, which is the open source project that I was the initial architect on, is what I will often use. That, or I'll often rip it apart and rebuild it for that. But again, virtually, Video.js does a decent job with that. I haven't played with JW's Dash implementation yet, so I'm not sure. But knowing the JW guys as I do, I expect that theirs is a pretty solid solution too. So the question is, will the MSC on Android using Dash give you an adaptive bitrate implementation? And the answer is absolutely yes. Oh, yeah, so YouTube today, if you hit YouTube in a modern browser, you are going to get Dash. In fact, it's always interesting. When you open up YouTube, if you right-click on the YouTube player, in the context menu that comes up, there is the bottom one that says Stats for Geeks that will tell you specifically what codec it's playing, what format it's playing, and if you're running it in a modern browser, the vast majority of times you're doing it, you're going to be seeing Dash. So the question, there's a number of issues with Flash video on Firefox, and there's always little tweaks you can do to make it less painful. You can't solve all of the problems all of the time, which is part of why I'm really happy that we now have media source extension support in Firefox. Other questions? So let me see if I got the question right. You're asking with YouTube and the ads, the Google ads that that YouTube has, are the ads also in Dash? I would expect that a fair percentage of them are. One of the bigger challenges, honestly, with advertising in media source extensions today is that a lot of your advertisers are still providing their ads in Flash. If you use any sort of network sniffer, you're going to see a bunch of FLVs coming through, which I've yet to see anybody write a transmuxer to play an FLV through media source extensions. So again, it was part of why Flash fallback becomes important, because the advertisers, they haven't caught up. Other questions? Excellent. Well, thank you guys very. Oh, sorry, question back here. Well, there was your first mistake. No, just kidding. Honestly, I would spend some time analyzing your logs, understanding what browsers your users are coming with, and figure out if the answers are there in your log files. If the vast majority, if 95% of your users are capable of playing that content back, then no, it was a perfectly valid choice. If 80% of your users can no longer watch your content, no, it was a horrific choice. So the question was, of the various video players, are there some that are better at connecting to various ad servers than others? And that was Anil's point earlier, is that some of them integrate with third parties better than others. Some of them integrate with some third parties better than others. So there's no one right answer. It's going to matter, vastly based on what analytics companies, what ad companies, who are you using, and do they play nicely together? So, again, virtually all of them can connect to some ad server or another. Many of them are able to connect with most of the ad servers. But it's a matter of figuring out what the right fit, which pieces fit better here versus there. Well, Flash and RTMP is probably the most viable browser-based solution today. I know some folks who are running some proof of concepts trying to find other ways of transmuxing various real-time protocols to come in through RTSP and other things, to come in through WebRTC, that is to say. And so there's a number of different, I don't know anything in production or anything that is a marketable solution today that does it, but there are folks who are experimenting in a lot of different directions there. Is that it? Well, thank you. We just helped Kaltura build their HLS for Android piece, so I, for purely selfish reasons, can recommend that one. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you guys very much. I'm sorry for the technical problems.